So what's your relationship with women?
There aren't any women.
In the past, what was your relationship with women?
Every variety, every form, every type of playing that game which shows up, every idea explored, every possibility explored.
What game?
Very, very young, for where we're conditioned to think that that relationship is very, very important, that it's going to meet the requirement of the urge to be related to another, to have partnership. Perhaps it's to have family, perhaps it's to have fun, perhaps it's to share sexuality, communication. Communication will probably be better. An ability to be able to communicate with one another in an adequate way, not emotively, but with clarity. To share inquiries.
So your paintings show that condition?
No, all the paintings were throwing different concepts on a surface and just looking at each one, because people come from a conditioned state toward one another, and often the self shows up for how the urges arises, for however that energy might arise, and that might be met with another. Obviously not just sexuality and communication, in clear communication, enjoying life with one another, what we call sharing.
What were you trying to tell through painting those women or many things people could see on your painting?
Not to say anything, it's always just been inquiry, it's been a set of question marks. Why this, why that, why this, why that? Obviously, at this age, you would look, if I was to look back at relationship in any form, actually, in no particular way, not just one-on-one with women, but one-on-one with everyone, with anything. To be with this, just to be with this. But when another comes in, wherever you share a space, for however a space appears of sharing, there's just a very, very simple meeting. But in certain spaces, it means that there also has to be some type of shared action, whether these are just basic functional things or other. And that of itself seems fine, except that people come from different stations of conditioning. And a lot of what we call, relationship has been very, very questionable, not accepted for all the time that I've been alive. That inquiry was in there. One could not assume anything. Let's say how my parents were, not that my parents had sort of a good relationship or people. It looked to be very, very foundational, mundane. It had a functionality, and it seemed to be more collective generally in the type of agitated space that I grew up through, where people were exposed to so many ideas of how a self should show up to be and the freedoms that were to be exercised, which challenged the very nature of why people came together.
What was your first inquiry when you started painting women or draw women when you were a child?
Just to be able to create the form. I mean, used to try to draw children, and as a child, I should say, both. But there was always a difficulty in it.
What both?
Men and women. It was just an ability to be able to draw, but it wasn't.
What was underlying the child? What was his query?
Well, how to draw it out of the imagination. Because I didn't have the luxury of having someone sit before me so I could study how to draw a person. No one's.
And that curiosity sustained the whole life?
Not just, no, it's so multifarious because there's infinite ways of depicting things right down to ideas. So, like anything that shows up, you can bring into visual terms or try bring it into visual terms. But, obviously these things are limited too.
What was your mother's role in your painting?
Well, there wasn't. I really didn't have the facility to be able to paint when I was younger because I didn't have the materials.
What would you say about your painting gift?
I'm not sure if it's really a gift. It's sort of an interest.
Where does it come from?
Oh, exposure.
Exposure to what?
Artists.
Whom?
For whatever I got exposed to.
Who were you first exposed to?
Oh, many artists.
Could you give us a few names?
I think the first one that really clicked would have been, it's hard to say, but probably Sidney Nolan's The Last Temptation of St. Anthony, which was in the local gallery down here. And I was quite intrigued by why someone would depict something so, and it paralleled to where my mother was in what she was experiencing as a born-again Christian position. So I was trying to assimilate what those feeling spaces were and for how people would communicate it. So there were things that were being described, suggested to me, and I could see that there was a feeling space in my mother where she was making efforts to be a better person for something that she saw about his position and struggling too against an already standing, conditioned self.
And all of those were shown in your painting?
Well, painting itself is, or drawing probably.
I mean, in your early years of joy.
Yes, I think. Well, it depends on, an influence can be taken directly from a piece of art. So those things might be formal interests, whereas expressive interests have to do with how you might describe a conditioned space. But often, like it started off very, very naive and ignorant in me because those question marks were so vast. I would need a lot of time to think, and I saw that in art I would have time to think.
What was your question mark?
Well, for everything that was appearing to be so, particularly human beings and how they communicate and don't.
What was that one dying question that the child wanted to know?
Well, the inability for people to really communicate clearly with one another. Like to really, really stand.
So were you asking why people are not communicating with one another very clearly as a child?
Oh yes, I was in the midst of it because there was so much misunderstanding that would happen in an instant for people just trying to be dominating.
Has that question been addressed?
How's that question? Well, it's ongoing. There's war, there's difficulty between.
So you have not found the answer yet to that question?
Well, it's not really about finding an answer. I know that what you do is you sit and you listen really carefully to another. you have an absolute openness to be able to accept everything that's coming to you. But
So
then,
have you found
wait
your
a
answer?
second, I haven't finished. I haven't finished. But there's one position where you can be open, and then for where you might propose question mark, it requires the other to be able to be open too. And this is really, the most wonderful experiences I've had since childhood onward. And a lot of this was just taken for granted in the first place because there's a certain plasticity in moving nicely with others, that if you're aware of that, you can just cooperate, and whether that's in play or function. And as long as you understand what's being asked of you, then you can meet that quite easily. But if that demand is sort of greater than your ability to be able to meet it, then often for me as a child it meant conflict, because the person would be dissatisfied for what they wished it to be.
Would you say that a sense of conflict as how the child sees the world, people's inability to communicate with one another, was the drive for you to move around through different circumstances so that you can paint, as in that you can dive into the inner world of communication?
I think you'd have to get your question clear with me.
Was that conflict the drive of your life movement?
No, not necessarily, because I have my own harmony. Like I sit easily, I can be with myself for vast amounts of time. I have spent most of my time here with no need for anything external.
We are talking about the younger version of you.
Oh yes, that's been here.
Have you always got that inner peace within you?
Oh yes, yeah. That thing came really, really early. I think it's there.
What thing came very early?
The recognition of that quietude where you can be in your own flow and carry on.
Was that drives the painting?
Well, that was just something that I seemed to be able to do. And look, I didn't have a huge amount of space for that, but I always went back to it, and it tended to go toward drawing more than painting because they were materials.
So the innate quietude sustains the painting.
It was something that just naturally happened as a flow. It was very, very easy. Like whatever was being done worked or didn't. But I would sit down as a child and paint 50 drawings in the morning. Not because they necessarily worked, but they engaged me for that time. I wouldn't just sit down and do a couple of marks and then run off. But I was in a position where my physicality was knocked out of me. So that little action boy that used to run and play and up trees and climb roofs was knocked out for a very, very long time. So drawing became a very, very good friend. The energy goes somewhere. You can sit and you can gaze out your window for so long. But volition comes up in us very, very quickly in the waking state. To be an activity in the world.
Does the quietude promote painting, or does the painting help you to find or reside in quietude?
No, painting is just something that you can do.
When painting was taken away from you, what would happen?
Oh, you mean once I learned one? No, I'd be fine. There was periods of time where there were many years where I didn't. I could go between different activities, but I didn't lean on art like that. It just happened. It just happened.
My question was not about the leaning onto art. Was it about?
I think we need to start again because
relationship between you and art.
This isn't really. It's all sort of like all over the place. I don't really know what you're wanting to get to I don't need to sort of talk about this as a mechanism. This as a mechanism is neither here nor there. It's unimportant. This as a mechanism doesn't matter. It's like anyone and everything. It doesn't matter. This doesn't matter.
So either look at it as a mechanism and use one sentence to describe your relationship with women.
Why are you putting a focal point on women?
That's not my question, that's Jan's question.
Oh, right. So you're getting information for Jan. If you would have told me that, I would talk to Jan. Why did you tell me that? Because it's like, he'll list all this and go, oh, king. I thought we were talking about something else, but...
Don't worry about it, I'll edit it. Just answer the question. What was your relationship with women?
Look, I don't mind appearing like an idiot. It doesn't really matter. But you know what happens? That in the midst of this, there's something really, really particular that I'm trying to communicate for where I thought we were talking initially. And this is where communication fails, because we don't have clear orientation.
So you failed your communication with women?
I take responsibility for that, and I'm taking responsibility for that right now.
So you failed your relationship with women? You failed your relationship with women?
No, on the level of communication with everyone.
So you failed to communicate with
sometimes, what does it mean to succeed? It's so marginal, like you keep a domestic space with a person, and it works for so many years. Was that a success? Well, I seem to spawn a lot of children, and I seem to be able to hold the space together for so many, many years. You see, so for whatever that was, and standing and showing up in that was simply that. And for me, sort of growing up in this period of time, like for how relationships work, you have to be able to work with one another in very, very, very clear terms. They are in really, really clear terms, but a lot of it just is assumed in another, that this is how I'm going to be, this is how she's going to be, and we're working together, and we're not. You only work together because you have an understanding for what you're working for. Basic things like, running a household isn't so difficult, but it can be if the standard isn't met. So you have to go through all of this type of thing, the most dreary, mundane things, right? Which are so fundamental, but they're not fundamental because people have different attitudes toward it. What represents chaos for one person is order for another.
So how do those relationships associated with your painting?
I don't think all this needs to be explained. I don't think art works on that level. What ends up happening is art becomes artifacts. They become long-lasting, standing things in themselves. That's the curiosity about them, way beyond what the artist is. And people can interpret it in whatever way they do, because there's a standing culture about art for how they come to it. Some people look at art as something that just goes with their lounge suite, or goes with their already standing art collection.
Do you mean you cannot explain?
No, I could, but like you could go into every little detail. It's so tedious. Everyone has their own life. It's not about sort of announcing this. It's about just simply making a painting in the end.
If you were to give a nutshell statement, what would that be?
The thing about paintings are things in themselves, be quite removed from the artist. You might have an inquiry into the artist in degrees, but you can only go so far, because very often that person will be dead. So that's the way it goes. You look at a cave painting or something that was painted 35,000 years ago, and you try to make sense of it. What you're left with are the formal values, and then the rest is speculation. The rest is speculation. In other words, it's a field for where your own self shows up in contrast to the thing that's being put before you. So what ends up happening is that thing in itself is static. So when people take interest in art, what they do is they witness themselves in their own speculation.